Welcome back to Face the Nation. We turn now to the Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S., Oksana Markarova. Great to have you back with us.
Good morning.
Your president and our president said that Ukraine's running out of ammunition. So how quickly will this latest U.S. package arrive, and how quickly will it make a difference?
Well, first of all, let me say how grateful we are to President Biden and to everyone for making this decision to provide us with this munition. I know everyone is discussing how difficult it was and sometimes even call it controversial, but there is nothing controversial about it. We are fighting on our territory, brutal enemy. There is nothing worse than tortures, rapes, and everything that Russians do on the territories they occupy, and we need to liberate as quick as possible. So we are really grateful that in times when we do need increased numbers of munitions to support our counteroffensive, that U.S. made the decision, and we really hope we will see it very quickly on the battlefield.
So these cluster munitions drop bomblets, and sometimes those bomblets don't explode right away, and years later they can be a danger. I've met victims who've been blinded and maimed in places where the U.S. dropped these decades ago. So when the White House says that Ukraine has made assurances on how it will use these, how do you do this and assure that civilians won't be hurt?
Well, first of all, let's remind where we start with. Ukraine is the most mined country now already. Russians mined everywhere. The unexploded ordnance is everywhere. So we're doing a lot of demining. And U.S., by the way, is helping us a lot in demining already now. With regard to these munitions that we will be getting from the U.S., first, they are of a much higher quality, so to start with. And second, as responsible as we are with all other American-supplied or European-supplied munitions, we are controlling it. We have a very responsible ways. We use the NATO type of log-fast system to record every unit that we have, where it is. We will use the same type of approach to this. We will know where we use it, how we used it. And of course, you know, every time we liberate our territories, these deminers are the first people that go there, try to make sure that the area is safe. So we will do exactly the same.
And I imagine Russia uses these on civilian areas. I have to imagine Ukraine has pledged not to do that and only to use them on soldiers.
Oh my God, they use this and phosphor and everything else specifically on civilian areas and destroying civilian areas.
And that's
we will not use it in civilian populated areas.
That's the war crime aspect that Russia has been criticized for on this. When you heard President Biden say Ukraine's not ready for NATO membership, what did you think?
We are getting ready for NATO membership. We know and we are doing very difficult reforms, even as we fight for it. What we are definitely ready for is for invitation. And I think, you know, with regard to the NATO membership, if you look at any aspect of it, Ukraine is very ready in a number of aspects. And if there is something that is left there, we can sure do it later on. But we are discussing now about the invitation. You know that in 2008, the open door policy towards Ukraine have been adopted. We want not only the door to be open, we want to be invited to come in.
Well, the White House seemed to close the door on that part of the invitation at least, but eventually allow for Ukraine to join NATO. That seemed to be the signal White House was sending on Friday.
Well, the discussions are still ongoing, and of course, it's the discussion that requires 31 countries to agree. And again, as you know, with the European Union membership, there is a path towards the European Union. We are a candidate country, and we are working towards our full membership. Similar approach we take with NATO. We want to be in NATO. The majority of Ukrainians support Ukraine in NATO. This is in our constitution. And we have done the majority of reforms already to be NATO eligible. We are ready to continue on that path, and we would like to see that our friends in NATO are together with us on this path.
This week, the largest nuclear plant in Europe, once again, was very much in focus on the front line of this conflict. Your president says Ukraine has intelligence showing that Russia will try to blow it up, that it has mined the area. The UN watchdog says they've only been able to search parts of the area. So far, it looks okay, but there are two key reactors they want access to. What is the level of risk right now?
The level of risk there is consistently high since March 4th, 2022, since Russians illegally occupied Ukrainian nuclear station. So we just have to be very clear from the start, every time we discuss Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, the largest nuclear plant in Europe, that the only source of risk there is Russia. You add to that Russia's absolutely irresponsible withdrawal or suspension of the New START treaty, their decision to deploy the tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, and it's clear that we are dealing with a nuclear terrorist. Now, look at Chernobyl station, which they also grabbed since they invaded us in February 22. As soon as Russians are out of there, there is no risk. Similar here, we all have to work together to get them out. Because again, let me remind you about the Kakhovka Dam destruction, which Russians did, knowing how devastating it will be. So the intent, and there is no red lines for them there. We just have to stay focused and get them out from the station. As soon as it's in Ukrainian hands fully again, there will be no risks.
Does Ukraine support what the UN's calling for, which is, sort of a safe zone around it so that Ukraine isn't shelling in the area and neither is Russia?
Look, all Ukraine should be demilitarized from Russian military. So we have to get them out from everywhere in Ukraine, not to allow them, create some safe zones for them inside Ukraine. We are very responsible, as you have seen during all this period, towards the Zaporizhzhia nuclear station. But the only answer to that problem is no Russians there. It's Ukrainian territory, it's Ukrainian station, and there should not be occupiers, brutal occupiers there.
We will be watching what happens this week at NATO, and so good to have you back with us, Ambassador. We'll be right back.
Thank you.
We turn now to the Republican governor of Utah, Spencer Cox. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
It's good to talk face to face. I know you're on this coast because of the National Governors Association and meetings there. And the group's putting some special focus on mental health, but broadly protecting kids. When it comes to children, firearms are the leading cause of death among kids. The Salt Lake City Tribune pointed out that at the state level, there's been an impulse to ban dangerous things for kids on many levels. You've talked about social media. You focused on transgender issues. But that doesn't extend to firearms, even at the state level. Why is that?
When you look at the gun numbers in the state of Utah, those numbers increasing are not being driven by people getting caught in the crossfire or kids shooting each other. It's being driven specifically by mental health and suicide issues. Now, we're doing more to help keep guns away from kids, keep them locked up, but what is it that's driving that desire to say life is not worth living anymore? And how do we as a society collectively work to make sure that kids know that it is going to get better and there is a reason to stay here? That's a huge focus for us as well.
Your state is the first, as I understand it, to restrict social media access by minors, although that law doesn't go into effect until March of next year.
Correct.
You just had this judge this week make a determination that the Biden administration should be prohibited from discussing with social media companies anything that encourages, pressures, or induces in any manner the removal, deletion, suppression, or reduction of content. Is that ruling going to affect what you are trying to do at the state level to protect young kids from harmful content?
I don't think so. I don't understand. That's more of a content restriction. I'm sure we'll have social media companies suing the state of Utah. In fact, we're going to be suing social media companies for the harm and damage that they're causing our young people. I suspect that at some point the Supreme Court will weigh in on this decision when it comes to restricting youth access. There's not just a correlation between social media use and an increase in suicide, anxiety, depression, self-harm. There is a causal link there.
There are 18 different states that have now enacted laws that restrict in some way access to gender transition care for kids. In Utah, you have said that you are just pausing access to that kind of care. You're not banning it. Do you have an end date to that pause? What specifically is the kind of data and research you need to see to say you will allow for it?
Yeah, so we don't have an end date, but we we do need more data and more information. This is such a charged topic that it's been impossible, I believe, to get good information here in the United States right now, because half the country doesn't want to touch it, and the other half is convinced that they already know the answer. And so I've really tried to look elsewhere at conversations that are happening in other countries, specifically in Europe, around this, where it's not quite as charged, looking at Sweden and Finland and France and the UK, other countries where they don't have the same culture war battles that we're having here. And they're also pushing pause. I mean, many of those countries are saying, look, this is...
specific part of it? Is it
both.
Hormone treatment, puberty blockers, surgery?
Both, all of the above, yeah.
Because the American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, and the American Academy of Pediatrics have said this kind of care, that they've rejected the claims that it is harmful.
Yeah, all but very political groups. And again, I believe that they are politicized. Those groups are politicized.
The American Academy of Pediatrics.
I absolutely do. Yes, yes. On this issue, it's impossible to get unbiased information out of the United States right now on this issue. I just don't believe it.
So just on the numbers, of 73 million children in the U.S., there were just 56 genital surgeries related to dysphoria between 2019 and 2021, according to the study by Komodo Health and Reuters.
Yeah, do you have the numbers on hormone therapy and
in those
puberty
years?
blockers?
What is the number?
They're exploding. We went from like 10 years ago to several hundred this past year. I mean, those numbers, and again, this is in Utah alone. Yeah.
And you don't know what's driving it.
Well, that's what these scientists in other countries are actually trying to figure out, where in the United States, we're putting our head in the sand and saying, we're not even going to talk about this or look about this. You can't even have a discussion about it. In other countries, they're saying, something is happening. Hundreds in my state, thousands all across the country that are making requests for this. And they're presenting with several other mental health issues as well.
In the numbers we saw, the trend is definitely up, but they're still pretty small in terms of surgeries and mastectomies. But
only in terms of surgeries.
Data.
Yeah, the other data, and you can look anywhere, this is not unique. Yes, there aren't a lot of surgeries happening, but the trend, it's not just up, it's up exponentially. It's a hockey stick increase.
It's still a small percentage, though. But I hear your point on wanting more data. Can I ask you specifically about a bill that is now law? You had an interesting stance on this. You rejected the bill initially. Your legislature overrode your veto. It's now law. And it would bar transgender students from participating in girls' sports. According to the reporting at the time, there were just 4 transgender players in the entire state out of 85,000 student athletes. At the time, you argued for empathy when you vetoed this. You said these are just 4 kids trying to get through the day. Rarely has so much fear and anger been directed at so few. Why didn't that call for empathy persuade your party? Why did they need to write something to affect 4 kids?
In my veto letter, I said I actually agree with what you're trying to accomplish here. I think it is wrong to have a transgender female, a person who was born a male, taking scholarships, records away from people. The Penn swimmer is the example of that, right? Okay. The example that everybody uses, and so that was my point. That should not happen. What we were negotiating in the state of Utah was something that would allow some kids to play and others not to, depending on their physical capability. I do believe that there is a lack of compassion and empathy in our politics today. We have a toxic division. The culture wars are happening. There are culture warriors on all sides that are trying to change, trying to get their way, trying to cancel others or prevent others from being able to do what they want to do. And it's definitely a problem. I'm hoping that Utah can be an example of being a little better on that side.
There are at least 6 current or former governors, Republican governors, running for president right now. Can any of them defeat Donald Trump in a primary?
Well,
to lead your party.
I hope so. I like governors. I think governors are great. I think governors have real experience. The great thing about governors is we actually have to get stuff done, right? We can't just do the performance thing. You have to, potholes aren't partisan.
Right.
You have to do those kind of things. And I think we have lots of amazing choices. And I'm really hopeful that we can turn the page and try something else, someone who can win, which I think is important. And I think any of those governors could win, and I certainly hope we'll give them a chance.
Governor, thank you. I'm glad to have you here in person, and hope to have you back.
Thank you. It's been an honor. Thank you.
We'll be back with a lot more Face the Nation. Stay with us. Last week saw 4 days of record temperatures, and this week is expected to be even hotter. We now want to welcome to the program Kate Calvin, NASA's chief scientist and senior climate advisor. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm excited to be able to ask you some of these questions that I think a lot of people are wondering this week in particular. Why is the weather so extreme? Can you explain that for non-scientists?
Yeah, so climate change is driving increases in temperature overall. We also have natural cycles that affect temperature, and so the one you're hearing the most about in the news is El Nino or La Nina. So El Nino years tend to be warmer than La Nina. 2022 was a La Nina year. It was actually the warmest La Nina year we've ever had. It was tied for 5th warmest overall. We're now moving into El Nino. So the combination of climate change and El Nino means we're seeing higher global temperatures, and that brings with it impacts all around the world to people, ecosystems, extreme events, and other changes that are impacting communities.
So ocean temperatures are rising, as I understand it, and that factors into this. Can you explain how?
So oceans absorb a lot of heat, and so we are seeing increases in ocean temperature. When we identify El Nino, it's based on ocean temperatures in a particular part of the Pacific. But the thing to keep in mind is, oceans are actually, land is warming faster than oceans. So the places where we live are warming faster than the ocean. So while we are seeing these increases in ocean temperatures, we're also seeing increases in temperature over land.
So NASA has been doing these reports where you're crunching some of the data to understand how to plan going forward. I was looking at one of them. It says there's going to be severe turbulence with airlines over large regions of the northern hemisphere. Are we already seeing that, and why would that happen?
So we are experiencing impacts of climate change everywhere around the world right now. There's different impacts in different regions. I think what's important to keep in mind is that climate change is more than just temperature. It's also affecting things like the water cycle. So we're seeing more heavy precipitation events, more droughts. We're seeing increases in extreme events like storms, and we can see those, and those impact how we travel, human health, agriculture, and all aspects of our lives.
But with the planes, how certain are you that this will happen, or is it already happening?
So there's studies that indicate that you can see increases in turbulence linked to climate change. At NASA, some of what we do around aircraft, we have a large aeronautics research team, but we look a lot at how transportation affects climate. So not just climate affecting transportation, but also how it affects it. And so we do a lot of research into making planes more efficient so they use less energy and generate less emissions and contribute less to warming in the future.
So there are also transportation issues along the Mississippi River mentioned in the report. Cargo shipments have been impacted by river levels. So how do industries who have to plan ahead and businesses that have to plan ahead take this into account? How prepared are we?
So one of the things that we work on is trying to make sure people have access to the information that can support planning. So for river flow, we actually launched a satellite in December called SWAT that's going to give us the first global survey of water running through rivers and lakes. So we'll be able to see how much water is running through those rivers and how that changes over time. And that kind of information can be used to better plan in the future.
And so NASA would share that?
All of our data is publicly available, and one of the things we're working on now is making it easier to use so that you don't have to process raw satellite data, but instead we give you an indicator that you can interpret and use in your planning. So as an example, we have a tool that's designed for farmers that helps them understand how much water their fields are losing so that they can better plan their irrigation.
NASA also put out a report in May that says climate change is contributing to a rise in Lyme disease, possibly, more mosquito-borne illnesses as well. Seasonal allergies are getting worse. I know plenty of people who are complaining about their allergies these past few weeks. My eyes were watering. How concerned do people need to be?
So there are a lot of effects of climate change on health. In terms of mosquitoes and other diseases that are carried by insects, what climate change can do is change where the geographic extent of those species. So, mosquitoes need hot conditions, they need water to breed. And so what climate change can do is change that extent so that we see in places where you have malaria, it could shift more northern latitudes or higher altitudes. But there's other effects of climate change. You mentioned pollen. One of the things that we saw here in the northeast of the US recently was about wildfire smoke. So there were wildfires burning in Canada, and the smoke from that came into the US and led to air quality concerns all across the northeastern US. And we'll see more of that with climate change.
More of these fires.
We'll see more. So what climate change brings is more fire weather. So conditions where it's hot, dry, and windy, more fuel for fire. So more dry vegetation that can burn and can also lengthen the fire season. So we're seeing all of those changes. What we're trying to do, though, is make sure people can be prepared for it. And so we can see where fires are burning now. We can see burn scars and burn perimeters. We can look at how emissions from fire move around the world.
Well, and that's what's interesting, is that this isn't just admiring the problem you're coming up with. Here's something you can use to plan for this scenario. But some of it sounds like a science fiction movie in terms of fear. There's something in here about frozen Arctic soils unleashing ancient microorganisms. Has that happened yet?
So, in the far north of the world, the soils store a lot of carbon, and there's methane underground. And so, as that thaws, scientists expect that you would see some more emissions associated with it. So that as you warm, you could trigger more emissions, and that's what's driving the warming that we're seeing now is greenhouse gas emissions. So things that affect those emissions will affect climate.
And you're going to continue to make this publicly available?
All of our data is publicly available, and we continue to add to it. So we're able to observe more about the planet and help people better prepare for the future.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
For breaking it down for us non-scientists. I appreciate it. We'll be right back. We don't usually put in a plug for rival broadcast networks, but we can't resist this one. Tune in tonight to cheer on our own Gayle King and her family. Yes, that's them. They're appearing on Celebrity Family Feud tonight at 8 o'clock. And of course, tune in on Monday morning to CBS Mornings, where you normally see Gayle, tomorrow and every day. That's going to be it for us here today. Thank you for watching. Until next week. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.